The further we go down this road of asking the technical experts to adjudicate this space, the more obvious it is that there is not a technical answer. There are always trade-offs.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we make the case for conserving nature and its biodiversity by building a robust, credible argument, one that sometimes requires us to re-examine conventional wisdom. I'm your host, Andre Mardo. The relationship between science, policy, and society is often framed as a search for objective answers. In reality, it's shaped by partial perspectives and competing forms of knowledge. Why do certain perspectives dominate, though? Why is there such a persistent expectation that science can deliver answers to fundamentally political questions? And how do these dynamics affect trust in expertise? To explore these questions, I spoke with Mark Neff, professor at the College of the Environment at Western Washington University. Mark's work sits at the intersection of environmental policy, and science and technology studies, focusing on how societies organize and use scientific knowledge in decision-making. We discussed the limits of scientific authority in a democracy, the tensions between different forms of knowledge, the risks of claiming certainty, and why acknowledging uncertainty may be essential to restore trust in science and policy. I began by asking Mark for an overview of how scientific choices help to structure policy debates.
When I'm talking to students and introducing some of these ideas, I often resort to medical examples. I find that there's a clarity that can come from jumping to a different context. So, one of the examples I often use is tuberculosis. I always ask my students what causes tuberculosis, and a few of them have taken enough biology that they come up with the answer that it's a bacterium, which of course is correct. And we treat bacterial infections with antibiotics. And yet, despite the fairly widespread availability of antibiotics, tuberculosis is the biggest killer of all infectious disease worldwide, almost all years, the COVID years being an exception. And while it's true that it's caused by a bacterium, it's only the desperately impoverished who are affected. It's only endemic in places with really poor access to housing, poor quality housing, poor nutritional access, and the worst of the prisons, right? So it is simultaneously a bacterial disease and a disease of poverty and desperation. And so a research agenda that focuses on either of those is telling a partial story.
Mm-hmm.
And any research agenda in any portion of our world necessarily does that, right? We shine the flashlight on a narrow portion of complex, intertwined, dynamic systems. And the understandings we gather directly imply what the solution is. If it's a bacterial disease, we treat it with antibiotics. If it's a disease of poverty, well, we're talking social interventions and poverty eradication.
Mm-hmm. And so why do you think there is a tendency to focus on just one or the other? I mean, why not a more holistic focus?
Well, this is mostly speaking from a US perspective. It's the one I'm most familiar with. But on a US university campus, well, first of all, each of us has our background disciplinary training, and we only know to ask about the world from a narrow set of methodological perspectives. And on university campuses, we heavily favor some disciplinary perspectives over others. That's true in research funding. It is also true in campus hierarchies of prestige and pay, and even the support in the form of new buildings and laboratories and that sort of thing. And part of the reason for that is directly financial. If you invent a new antibiotic, you can patent that, and your university can earn royalties, and it enriches everyone up and down the economic stream to create a new pill to intervene with tuberculosis. If you go out as a sociologist and you emphasize the social aspects of this, there's nothing about that is patentable. And in fact, even more harmful to the impact of that narrative. It goes against our status quo power structures of the world. And the people with power under the status quo are a lot less enthusiastic about that kind of approach.
So you're talking kind of specifically about how the academic realm meets policy, right? So
Sure.
these fields are isolated on the different parts of the campus, but then there's kind of like a gap between the production of the research and the taking up of the research by policymakers, right? And then those policymakers kind of, well, there has to be some mechanism at the science policy interface to make sure that they consider all the relevant factors, right? And would you maintain that that's missing, or that's not necessarily functioning properly?
I mean, that's probably going to differ hugely from issue area to issue area. But in general, we're awash in scientific, technical, even social scientific information.
Hmm.
And I see few examples in the real world where decision makers have the time and the capacity to go find all of the potentially relevant information
Hmm.
themselves to distill that into some kind of an informed decision context. And thus the need for institutions that can kind of stand at that interface of the scientific world and the policy world.
Do you think there's also a strong political element to this kind of spotlight focus? Because I'm not sure the particular example that you mentioned now is maybe a bit difficult to align with that, but you can imagine other examples where, a more conservative perspective might want to focus on one truth behind an issue, and a more progressive approach might want to focus on another truth, and then you kind of get these kind of spotlit and seen as one versus the other, whereas they actually need to both be considered. Is that a major factor?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And, we can jump to a more overtly environmental or conservation example, but that's always going to be the case, right? We have so many scientific and social scientific lenses to understand the world that a reasonable person, without any intent to do so, that goes to try to learn about the technical context of a decision space, they're going to end up with a partial perspective. And there is no, even for an institution sitting at that science policy interface, there is no apolitical, technically correct way of assembling all of those partial lenses
Hmm.
to get the more quote unquote objective context to inform those decision makers. It's always going to be partial,
Right.
the information context that you're able to assemble.
Right. But it does kind of, I guess, highlight the importance of those institutions like the IPCC, and in the biodiversity realm, IPBES would be the key one there. And I think it also kind of explains why so many scientists and politicians and people from all different sort of sectors refer to institutions, especially like IPCC being the really famous one, sort of refer to that as kind of like a basis. So even though it's not perfectly objective, it's kind of the closest to objective, and there's a real credibility that comes with that sort of consensus, I suppose you could say.
No, I think that's right. And the legitimacy comes from, you know, their long duration and the trust that they accrue through time by trying to stay on the straight and narrow
Hmm.
and not venture too far into overt political framings.
Hmm.
Uh, and part of that's going to necessarily be drawing lines around which aspects of this system can we technically describe with a consensus statement, and which of these things are, you know, up for negotiation by more overtly political processes.
Hmm. That does kind of bring us to another of the questions that I mentioned I wanted to ask, which is the US withdrawal from several international organizations recently. It's a couple of months ago. Many of these, there were 60 something organizations, and many of them are environmental organizations, and they do include the IPCC and IPBES. Um, how does this event kind of align with or dovetail with the work that you're doing? I mean, has your work helped you to understand why that's happened? And maybe along with that, do you think that the US withdrawal has a lot to do with the with sort of a concern about the legitimacy of these organizations? I mean, that's pretty much the stated reason for their withdrawal, isn't it? Or part of the reason.
Yeah, that's my understanding of that. That's the
Mm.
justification. So from where I stand academically, that Republicans today would be skeptical of these international organizations is entirely predictable. So anthropologists who try to understand, something about the cultural norms that exist in a pluralistic democracy emphasize that we have different visions in our brain when we think of what a good and a just world looks like. And for some of us, a good and a just world is governed by hierarchies of expertise that inform hierarchies of power in government, for example. And so the more traditionally democratic in the United States approach of leaning on experts' advice within regulatory agencies to make technically informed decisions that impinge on people's choices and economic activities and whatnot. That's one of these, it's a more hierarchical approach. And almost definitionally for the Republican Party, they have identified as, the party of devolving from the federal government to the state government. And the state government's legitimate roles are even very diminished as compared to what others might value. They're inherently skeptical of these accreting layers of governance. And many of these international organizations to that cultural worldview, they really smell of global government, and that is something that Republicans have been deeply skeptical of from the outset.
Hmm.
And from when I say from the outset, I'm saying, early days of Kyoto negotiations, et cetera. So it is entirely predictable that even just as a politically, a symbolically important political move, that Trump would reject many of those organizations.
I mean, I everything that you say makes complete sense. I'm also just interested in the tendency among people in our field to not be introspective about this move. So it's a pretty devastating move in terms of funding and, well, especially funding, but sort of other forms of support as well. And so there's sort of a fair amount of finger pointing going around, and that's understandable and justifiable. But I also am interested in where we could have done better. Could we have bulletproofed these organizations to prevent something like this from happening? They are very bureaucratic. There is a huge amount of repetition and, or duplication rather that happens between them. And maybe most of all, I think that some of them have in recent years become quite sort of adventurous in the degree to which they have advocated for really revolutionary kind of transformative change. And I guess that's kind of something, I have some sympathy, let's
Yeah,
say.
sure.
So I hesitate to use those words even, but I have some sympathy for a skeptical point of view for those reasons, and especially that last reason.
No, I think that's right. And one of the real challenges with this whole space is that the sins of a single self-appointed spokesperson for science or for one of these institutions is visited upon the whole enterprise, right? So anytime you have for example, a climate scientist who says, climate change is real, therefore we need a carbon tax. And they don the lab coat with all of the expected authority of science when they say so. They're very smart people who have differing policy perspectives with what we should do in the face of climate change. And when they see
Hmm.
someone who is advocating for some transformative change because of quote unquote science says so,
Hmm.
they invite scrutiny on the whole enterprise. And any of these, international organizations that strays from being something of a scientific consensus generating process and strays instead into advocating for change runs that risk. And all the more so when they're advocating for something that is a transformative change. And it makes
Hmm.
all the sense in the world, right? If you're advocating for not just incremental change, but something really radical and transformative, anyone who's vested in the status quo, as in my paycheck depends on my work that somebody else might be saying has an impact on biodiversity or on climate change.
Hmm.
My paycheck is threatened by this quote unquote transformative change that someone is advocating as a necessary outfall of the science. I would have every reason in the world to ask really hard questions of the institution that's making that claim. You know, which of these policy pronouncements is actually a scientific technical finding and which are usurping political decision spaces. And with any of the more scientific claims, I have every incentive in the world to pick at scientific understandings. And when we do that, when we ask harder and harder questions of the science, one of the things that happens is scientists recognize that all research is fallible and could be done differently. And they can go back and redo the research, starting maybe with a different set of assumptions or using a different statistical tool set to confirm or validate the prior scientific finding. That just takes time. And if you offer a scientist money to replicate or to do something slightly differently, every
Hmm.
scientist in the world is happy for additional grant money. And so, anytime anyone's making claims that, science justifies radical transformative change, actors who are averse to that change have an entire toolkit for questioning the science, keeping the scientists busy with the next set of questions, and forestalling that change.
Right. But I guess that also doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong to challenge the change, right? Like that's sort of a separate question as to whether that change, the transformative change that's being called for is justified.
Oh, for sure. And if you look at some of the most radical changes that have happened in environmental policy, many of them are actually quite gradual, and they only look radical in hindsight
Mm-hmm.
after decades have passed. So I'm thinking, for example, of limiting the chlorofluorocarbons that were so detrimental to stratospheric ozone. In hindsight, it looks like we had a globally negotiated treaty to phase out these compounds. In reality, it was a very incremental and slow process that started with, when I was a kid in the 1980s, CFCs were taken out of the cans of hairspray as the propellant. Nobody knew, nobody cared
Mm-hmm.
that you swapped out CFCs for some other compressed gas. It was easy. The US took the lead on that. And every little incremental step like that makes subsequent steps all the easier. In retrospect, you can look back and say, wow, that was an aggressive global treaty based effort that radically transformed our use of CFCs in a remarkably short time period.
Mm-hmm.
That is true. But had the globe gone about that advocating, we have a hypothesis that chlorofluorocarbons might persist and migrate into the upper atmosphere where it's possible the chemistry is different and it could be altering the structure of the ozone layer that protects us from ultraviolet light. Many, many actors would have pushed back against such a transformative change.
Mm.
Transformative change, we might need that in the face of climate change or the biodiversity crisis. But the best way to get there might be more frequent, smaller steps, little incremental steps. And every single one of those little incremental steps makes the next one seem a little less daunting.
Right. Yeah, as you mentioned earlier, or as you kind of implied, that there's a difference between the process of transformative change and the goal of transformative change. And I think that some of the discourse at the moment about transformative change doesn't distinguish clearly between those two.
Yeah.
And so it sounds, I think to those who are skeptical, if you make it sound like it's a process, which means rapid and radical and starting right now, that's much more scary than, something to aim for, like a majorly different future that we're aiming for and that we can get to in different ways.
Yeah. And if you look at, jumping to climate change, we've had, I'll speak for the United States because that's where my knowledge base is better. We've had remarkably little progress on decarbonization through the decades, despite all of the scientific attention, all of the policy attention,
Mm.
all of the increasing importance given to it in Hollywood and pop culture. Remarkably little progress, in part because it looks like a truly daunting challenge. Fossil fuels are everywhere. They're in our HVAC systems, in our offices, in our homes. They power our cars that are everything in the United States, air transit, shipping products around the globe. Fossil fuels are intimately intertwined in all aspects of our economic and social lives. If we say what we have to do to deal with climate change is rapidly phase out fossil fuels, it comes across as downright threatening.
Mm.
And that invokes that dynamic we talked about a little bit ago, where everyone has legitimate, rational reasons to look for problems in that logic chain. Because the consequences of making those changes, they seem genuinely daunting. The Inflation Reduction Act under President Biden, that Trump has since done everything he can to undo, was a radically different approach to climate policy. It was not, let's put a cap on emissions. It was not directly challenging the fossil fuel companies' economic well-being. It was, let's enable the technologies that would facilitate a transition. And so all kinds of incentives around heat pumps for houses and for businesses. There are all kinds of incentives to generate a hydrogen economy as a potentially alternate fuel source for the things that are harder to substitute. You can't use batteries in airplanes, so we need some other liquid fuel, right? So there are all kinds of incentives to generate almost from scratch a hydrogen economy. And in designing a policy that way, that had it been left in place, could have been a genuinely transformative change, but it wasn't posited as the status quo is killing the earth. We have to stop today.
Mm.
Right. And so you can get the outcome by taking on power players, by taking on everyone who sees their economic well-being as tied up with a fossil fuel economy, or you can sidestep it and make a different future possible via concerted R&D, industrial policy efforts.
So that's interesting. So, despite that, the Inflation Reduction Act has been highly contested. I mean, it struggled to get through. It had to sort of change its name and change its budget, even though it's still a huge budget. And as you say, now the current administration is doing what it can to dissemble it.
It's true that the Trump administration is doing everything it can to undo it. Um, I, not knowing the full details, it appears that that's in part because it was one of the signature achievements of the Biden administration,
Hmm.
as much as it being a target for being a climate policy. But, pretty much as soon as it passed, Republicans started assembling a wish list of which parts of this are we going to disassemble when we have the power. And a dynamic emerged where there are many, many Republican senators and representatives who actually went to bat to defend portions of that law that benefited their state.
Mm.
And so some parts of that law were politically durable because they were seen as good policy regardless of climate change.
Hmm.
And that's one of the things that I think is missing from a lot of our environmental discourse is we treat everything as inherently adversarial. And we almost assume that an environmentally beneficial policy comes at the cost of someone else.
Hmm.
And when things are posited that way, any environmental policy that gets enacted is reasonably a target for the people who see their welfare as challenged by it. But if we're creative with our policy making, people can see that they can benefit from a policy that also benefits the environment.
Hmm.
One of the examples I often use in my classes with my students, the state in the United States that has the highest installed wind capacity, wind electrical generation capacity, and it's either the top or it's closely approaching the top in solar, is Texas. And it makes a ton of sense for Texas, but you don't go down there and congratulate the ranchers who have wind and solar on their ranches for their green, environmentally friendly activities, or they're likely to knock down the solar panels. They're installing these things because it makes economic sense for them to do so. The dynamic throughout the West, and this is true in Texas, is frequently that people who make a living from ranching and from farming, they're seeing their property taxes go up and up as suburban and exurban communities sprawl, right? If a neighbor sells out for housing development, the value of a ranch in terms of property taxes goes up and up. And a lot of people identify with those kinds of careers, right? They identify, I'm a rancher, I come from a ranching family. And those rising property taxes are fundamentally threatening to that way of life. But if someone comes along and says, I'll give you such and such royalties annually if you keep your ranch as open space for grazing and for the wind turbines, there are a lot of people who say, yes, please, I will take your annual check because it allows me to maintain the lifestyle that is a big part of my identity.
Hmm.
The same way they would say yes to the oil derricks, right? It's an economic opportunity that makes sense for them based on their perspectives. It also really makes sense for everyone who's concerned about the environmental impacts of our energy systems. We're all better off for Texas ranchers adopting wind and solar, even if they're doing it for their own economic well-being. And there's so many opportunities to find if we don't see environment as inherently in contestation with economic concerns, there's so many opportunities to find these sometimes little, sometimes meaningful win-win situations.
Right. What you've been exploring so far, for one thing, demonstrates how challenging it is to satisfy different interests, right? And I know that in your work, you've looked at not just different political interests, but different forms of knowledge, which is an even kind of deeper difference. In practice, which forms of knowledge, especially sort of drawing on your work, which forms of knowledge tend to be favored within current scientific systems? And perhaps you can say a little bit about the why as well.
Yeah, so part of my dissertation work was looking at how research priorities emerge within the field of ecology, scientific ecology. And part of that project was a bibliometric study. So studying publication patterns in ecology to understand what are the trends. And then once you document the trends, then you can look for what are the drivers. And at that time, and this was, 2007 to 2009 was when I was doing this portion of the project. And I think the trends have largely held. The fields of ecology that were very data heavy, computer heavy, remote sensing heavy were ascendant. and the more field-based, immersive, slow kind of, developing data sets and knowledge bases over the course of seasons, years, decades. Anything that looked like that was meaningfully on the decline. And there are layers of causation for that. Some of it is that we now have these massive data sets that are available online, and students are learning analytical tools, big data, statistical, multivariate analysis tools to try to make sense of those. And they can do that work from their office in front of a computer. And sometimes, once you develop some of these analytical tools, you can apply them to multiple data sets or across multiple regions. And when so many of our publication incentives at the level of academia are based on productivity, how many papers can you write?
Mm.
How high of an impact factor do those journals where they're published? How high is that impact factor? How many citations can you accrue? These fast-moving fields that don't require field work, they generate lots of papers, lots of citations. And so there's kind of a self-reinforcing feedback loop around publication incentives that I think is a big part of the push toward data-heavy sciences. Then there are sociological aspects to that as well around, kind of a cultural phenomenon is the more research is rooted in quantitative numbers, the more we think of them as objective and as transcending politics and
Hmm.
values. And that's on the surface apparent, right? But the we end up accidentally bringing in all kinds of layers of values without intending to do so and without self-awareness, no matter what research agenda you pursue.
Yeah. Once there's a number, I mean, you either believe it or you don't, right? It's kind of it sort of gets rid of all the nuance once there's a once there's a specific figure involved. But I'm also kind of interested in, you spoke about different forms of academic knowledge. What about indigenous and local knowledge?
Sure. There's plenty that any given scientific lens cannot access about the world. And the fact that a given scientific lens cannot make sense of it does not mean it's not real,
Hmm.
right? There's a lot that is hidden behind just the noise of the complexity and dynamism of the world that our statistical tools can't make heads or tails of. There are local phenomena that aren't representative or that are not observable if you zoom out, in scale. And there are other approaches to learning, such as, indigenous knowledge, knowledge learned over generations of living in and working within systems. And, people who work in ecosystems, even over the course of a career, develop some of that knowledge just through lived experience. And it's absolutely real. And sometimes sciences can come in and document and quote unquote validate that knowledge, right? Put the scientific stamp of this is real on some kind of emergent indigenous knowledge. Most of our pharmacopoeia around the world, like the pharmaceuticals that we all depend on, is derived this way. The famous example, aspirin, is derived from birch bark, which indigenous communities around the world have understood to, be a painkiller forever. So indigenous knowledge is real or can be. Knowledge gleaned through lived experience can be real for farmers, for ranchers, for foresters, etc. But that's not as easy as saying all knowledge claims that invoke indigenous knowledge or knowledge through lived experience are valid. Just the same way as there's plenty that we accept within a scientific discipline today that 10 years from now will look fundamentally naive, right?
Hmm.
Knowledge claims, no matter where they're rooted, are potentially incorrect. And so you don't get a get out of jail free card when someone says this is indigenous knowledge, this is real. One of the examples that I often draw upon is In the Western United States, there's a family, the Bundy family, Cliven Bundy. He was a rancher in Nevada. He's a fundamentalist Mormon, and he believed that God gave the Mormons the land in Nevada for their own use. And he had an armed standoff because he had not been paying his grazing fees over the course of decades. So he owed like millions of dollars in grazing fees to the federal government. And he claimed that he had place-based knowledge of like how many cows he can have on this range and how it ought to be managed that is superior to the knowledge of the BLM managers based on his lived experiences. He was, to all appearances, a nut job. He had no real understanding of how those ecosystems worked. He was claiming essentially indigenous knowledge or knowledge from lived experience. There's no easy way to differentiate between him and other folks who make the same knowledge claim, but have something more analogous to or a knowledge base that people, scientists and others might accept as potentially valid
Mm.
about an ecosystem. So you're still stuck with the demarcation problem. What counts
Yeah.
as legitimate knowledge? Someone's labeling it indigenous knowledge or lived experience knowledge doesn't get you out of jail for free.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I wasn't actually expecting that answer, but it's a really interesting one, and it's kind of leads neatly to the follow-up question I wanted to ask you, which was, well, first, just a bit of background. And I'm probably a bit more familiar with the IPBES negotiations than you are. But something which I've noticed and which I've discussed with others on the podcast before is a tendency to not only elevate indigenous and local knowledge to the same level as scientific knowledge, but a little bit beyond as well, in a certain sense. So, in one way, I think it's a little bit superficial that they're actually not giving it sufficient recognition, but they're really trying hard. So I give them a lot of credit for that. But the part that concerns me a little bit is that they are regarding, and when I say they, I mean the governments that are negotiating this agreement. They tend to treat indigenous and local knowledge, and especially indigenous knowledge. So the example you gave now, I would regard more as local than indigenous, but the two are married to varying extents. But there's a tendency to treat especially indigenous knowledge as sacred and not questionable. And so as a result, there's kind of a tendency to just steer clear of any criticism of it, which also I think it's sort of a bit of the bigotry of low expectations rearing its head there. And I just don't know if it's good for anybody, that kind of approach. So a bit of a monologue and just my personal opinion and my personal concerns there. But does that kind of ring true in any way to what you've sort of observed in the literature and in general discussion?
Um, it absolutely rings true to what I've observed in the literature. And when I say that, part of it is, being an active reviewer in the literature
Mm,
and, coming across knowledge claims rooted in indigenous knowledge, where folks are trying to publish in more technical journals. And it's a super touchy area, right?
mm,
Because I am 100% on board with acknowledging that there's real, meaningful knowledge that sometimes can only be gained over the course of generations through that, cultural engagement with ecosystems. But as you're articulating, you have to be able to question a knowledge claim, particularly when it's in tension with other knowledge claims. And productive discussions about technical aspects of our world are impoverished if anyone gets some kind of a authority to make claims that are beyond questioning.
mm.
But I also think that we tend to get, when we're moving from our understandings of the world to our decisions of what to do to manage the world, I think we overemphasize the need to have the settled answers before we act. even going back to the regulatory approach to intervening with chlorofluorocarbons with stratospheric ozone depletion.
Mm.
We made a lot of those early decisions before there was anything approaching scientific certainty that there even was a hole in the ozone layer, right? So we were acting in the absence of settled knowledge.
Mm.
And I think in many cases, there's opportunity to act in the face of uncertainty. If we expect certainty before we act, it will not emerge for some of the dynamics that we've talked about. And that's all the more true when we open up the dialogue to different forms and sources of knowledge, right? When
Hmm.
we bring in indigenous knowledge, those are the kinds of insights that can come from indigenous knowledge don't even necessarily map onto scientific disciplines. So bringing in additional knowledge creates additional difficult to reconcile insights into the knowledge domain.
Mm.
And all of those competing understandings, that is uncertainty. So, like, the more we're open, and I think we should be to different forms and sources of knowledge,
Mm.
I think part of the response has to be acceptance that many of our key decisions have to come while uncertainty persists.
I can't help being reminded of the whole kind of COVID response situation.
Great example.
Probably the biggest mistake that was made by governments around the world was trying to convince people that they were sure what the right answer was, and then changing what that answer was to various questions, from time to time, rather than just saying, "Look, this is the best we can do right now. It could change tomorrow."
And there's a huge cost to that, right? So, the World Health Organization and the US health authorities maintained for an embarrassingly long time that COVID was spread via particulates, fomites, right? The splatter from sneezes and coughs. Very early epidemiological studies showed that that was not likely,
Hmm.
right? And so there was uncertainty from the get-go in those understandings. Those understandings were based on prior coronaviruses.
Hmm.
They could have, should have acknowledged uncertainty and said, in the face of uncertainty, here's our best advice. We will update you as we learn more. And when they failed to do so, part of the story of our polarization around expertise in the United States is that some of our respected scientific authorities made claims of certainty when they should have known better.
Hmm.
And, we have so much information abounding on the internet that it is super easy to find counter evidence that the authorities should have acknowledged from the get-go in published peer-reviewed literature from the outset. And the fact they didn't acknowledge that uncertainty has unleashed a backlash against expertise,
Yeah.
and undermined the ability of anyone, donning the lab coat and claiming scientific expertise to
Yeah.
speak with authority in the future.
Yeah. It's such a kind of microcosm of what's happening in environmental science, I think, as well. This idea of just admitting uncertainty. I think that a lot of the more sort of radical headlines that you're seeing in the media, which is sort of sometimes not reflective of the science, is kind of a reflection of this need of academia perhaps to project certainty, or of policymakers to project this idea that they're certain of outcomes. Um, Mark, I was just looking at the time. We've just got less than 10 minutes left, and I wanted to, if you don't mind, just pivot to a slightly different question, which is something which is probably touched on a few times through the discussion. And maybe this is an odd time to bring it up, but I just wanted to kind of fit it in somehow.
Sure.
And that is your focus on democracies. I noticed that the word sort of comes up quite a lot. Can you just explain sort of why in the work that you look at, why you and I can imagine what your answer might be, but why you focus specifically on democracies, or why you specify democracy as a component when you're looking at I guess, the science policy interface?
Yeah. So, and this is something I've increasingly come to lean on and be desperately enthusiastic about, even as our democratic systems are increasingly in disarray. Since the outset of the environmental era, so the late 60s, 1970s, increasing aspects of our life have been administered by bureaucrats. We set up the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States to administer the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all of this just piling on of additional layers of legislation
Hmm.
and a regulatory framework for many aspects of our life. And we said, hey, technical experts, lean on the best available scientific knowledge to make informed decisions. And they've done a remarkably good job of trying to navigate the increasingly intense politics at that interface of trying to take scientific information and make regulatory decisions based on it.
Hmm.
But some of that, the political outfall of that is that environmental concerns are increasingly partisan. And so every protective environmental policy, there's now a professional industry actor who's there to counter technical knowledge claims. And you
Hmm.
can look at any regulatory decision around an insecticide or a fungicide or whatever, and you have dueling experts that are each making just layers of informed technical arguments directed at each other.
Hmm.
And the further we go down this road of asking the technical experts to adjudicate this space, the more obvious it is that there is not a technical answer. There are always trade-offs, right? So this insecticide may yield real improvements to agricultural productivity in some systems managed in a particular way. It also is a suspected carcinogen,
Hmm.
right? And so it's going to have some level of suspected impact on human health and well-being. And maybe, the amphibians have a third set of impacts that they may face. These are all technical facts. There is no technical expert who can kind of assimilate and integrate these technical understandings to make an informed decision. We really expect that to work, and it doesn't. And we end up developing expertise in narrow framings to where I can go take or teach a class that would focus on one aspect of one of these questions. And I could train a whole bunch of students to understand the world through that lens. But there's another professor elsewhere on campus who's teaching other aspects of that problem
Hmm.
space and churning out technical experts to bolster that understanding. We live in a democracy. We have to figure out how to make decisions that are in part technical, right? So how to navigate these regulatory decisions. There are all kinds of technical inputs that we want to be aware of, but it is about trade-offs. It is inherently about trade-offs. And the processes by which we make those decisions have to have sufficient democratic trust and accountability that we can all say at the end of the day, yes, this is the decision and we have to move on.
Hmm.
There's a lot that can go wrong in that space, but I think we have to open up that space to be more explicit about what the trade-offs are,
Hmm.
such that in a pluralistic democracy, people from different perspectives can look at a regulatory body and say, I know that my concerns are heard and they're not papered over as irrelevant because someone pushed a technical framing that rendered my concerns irrelevant, right?
Hmm.
There's a lot of power dynamics that play out in those regulatory processes when we pretend that politics has no place. And I think we really need to start thinking about how we make democratically robust decisions that can take into account also the technical considerations.